The soft cling of my champagne glass froze me when my daughter-in-law mocked me at my own son's wedding. Still, I only tightened my fingers around the stem, swallowing the insult the way I'd swallowed years of her quiet cruelty. As that cold glass pressed into my palm, its tremble felt like every boundary I'd let her cross. While the same fragile sound echoed, I realized I'd spent too long allowing disrespect just to keep my son close. The same faint ring told me silence had made me look weak. That's when my daughter, a Navy SEAL, stepped forward and slapped her, and said the words I'd never needed to. Don't ever disrespect my mother again. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The wedding invitation arrived in a cream-colored envelope, the gold foil letters on the front shimmering in the afternoon sunlight. Noah and Claire Walker, it read, elegant and impersonal. Maggie stared at it for a long moment, her fingers hovering over the edges as though the paper might burn her. There was a time when she'd have felt nothing but joy at the thought of her son's wedding. But now, the thought twisted something deep in her chest, like an old wound she couldn't quite heal. She set the invitation down on the kitchen counter and turned away. A deep sigh slipped from her lips, too soft to catch her daughter's attention as Tessa walked in. "You're going, right?" Tessa asked, almost as if she had read her mind. Maggie didn't answer at first. She just stared out the window, where the sunlight flickered through the trees. Soft but bright, like a distant promise of something better. "I don't know," Maggie murmured, her voice low. "I haven't spoken to Noah in months. And Claire, you know how she's always been." Tessa's presence was a constant source of strength, but even her reassuring silence couldn't stop the knot in Maggie's stomach from tightening. She had seen the changes in her son, the way he had shifted in Claire's orbit. Quiet, withdrawn, almost as if he was afraid to challenge the unspoken rules of his marriage. But more than that, it was the distance, the unspoken divide that had crept between them ever since Claire entered their lives. Claire's sharp words, her cold glances, they had all been enough to drive a wedge deep between mother and son. "You're his mother," Tessa said simply, pulling Maggie from her thoughts. "He needs you there." Maggie turned slowly, meeting her daughter's gaze. Tessa had never been one to sugarcoat things. If anyone could push Maggie to face the uncomfortable truth, it was Tessa. She could still see the shadows of their past in her daughter's eyes, the way Tessa had always been her protector, her defender. But this was different now. Tessa was a Navy SEAL, a force in her own right. Maggie wasn't sure if she could rely on her daughter to fix everything this time, but Tessa wasn't asking her to. "You're right," Maggie said, her voice gaining strength. "I'll go, but I won't let them break me." Tessa's lips quirked into a small smile, the kind that said everything without saying a word. They both knew this wouldn't be easy. The wedding was everything Maggie had expected. Pristine, lavish, and full of faces she didn't know, but felt she was supposed to recognize. The high-ceilinged venue glittered with golden chandeliers, and the scent of roses and lilies clung to the air. She stood at the back of the room, away from the guests, her eyes fixed on Noah as he stood at the altar, looking more like a stranger than the boy she had raised. He was handsome, of course. She had always known he would be. But there was something hollow about his smile, something missing in the way he looked at Claire as she walked down the aisle toward him. Maggie felt the stir of old memories, the countless hours spent helping Noah with his schoolwork, cheering him on at sports events, and holding him close when he was heartbroken after his first love had left. That Noah felt so far away now, and the man before her, the one she was supposed to be proud of, seemed so unreachable. Tessa was at her side, a quiet presence that reminded Maggie she was not alone, but even her daughter couldn't fill the silence that had fallen between her and Noah. Maggie clenched her fists, her nails biting into the palms of her hands, trying to steady herself. As the ceremony progressed, Maggie tried to focus on the words being exchanged, on the vows, the promises. But every glance at Noah only deepened the rift. His eyes met hers only once, and it was so fleeting, so distant, that it was as though he had seen a ghost. The reception that followed was no better. The room buzzed with idle chatter and clinking glasses, but Maggie could feel the weight of it all, the unbearable spotlight on her. She knew how out of place she looked, like a misplaced relic of a past life, someone who didn't belong among the polished perfection of Claire's carefully curated guests. And then Claire appeared. As if on cue, her sharp eyes glinting as she sidled up to Maggie with the kind of smile that made Maggie want to look away. "Such a lovely dress," Claire remarked, her voice sweet, too sweet. "But don't you think it's a little dated?" Maggie's breath caught in her throat, but she forced a smile. She wasn't going to rise to this. She wasn't going to give Claire the satisfaction. "I'm glad you think so," Maggie replied evenly, though the words felt like they were scraping her insides raw. Claire's lips curled into a more smug smile. "Oh, I do. But, you know, it's hard to stay relevant when you're so far removed from the social scene, isn't it?" Her voice dropped to a near whisper. A pointed jab at Maggie's success in real estate and her ongoing work with nonprofits. It was the same tone she always used, condescending, like Maggie was somehow beneath her. Maggie's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. She wouldn't let Claire have the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. From across the room, Noah caught her eye again, but this time he didn't even smile. His gaze was distant, almost apologetic, but it was too little, too late. Maggie felt the sharp pang of abandonment, and the bitter taste of years of quiet neglect settled in her throat. She watched, helpless, as the evening unfolded around her, her son, her family, all of it slipping further and further out of her reach. The night was still young, but Maggie had already made her decision. She was done pretending. Maggie forced her shoulders back, straightened her spine, and smiled, though it felt more like a mask than anything resembling joy. The clinking of glasses and laughter from nearby tables echoed through the reception hall, but all of it felt distant, like the sound of a world she no longer belonged to. She'd been here for what seemed like hours, trying to make herself small, to stay out of the way. Her son's wedding, a day that should have been filled with celebration, had turned into a personal torment. The weight of Claire's barb still burned in her chest. The comment about the dress, the whispered insinuations about Maggie's life choices. They dug deeper than they should have. But Maggie had kept her silence, choosing to breathe through the sting. The years of this, of Claire's passive-aggressive, cutting remarks, had taught Maggie one thing: just don't react. Don't give her the satisfaction. But Claire wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Maggie had been scanning the room, her gaze flickering over the guests when she felt the ice-cold pressure of Claire's presence at her side again. The girl had an uncanny ability to appear, as if summoned by some unseen force. Claire leaned in slightly, her perfume, sickly sweet, cloying in Maggie's nostrils. "Do you even know how outdated all this is, Maggie?" Claire's voice was louder this time, enough to cut through the soft hum of conversation around them. "Your whole life, it's like you're living in some kind of fantasy world." She almost sneered as she spoke, her gaze sweeping Maggie from head to toe. "I mean, do you really think Noah respects you? Look at you." Maggie's hands clenched at her sides, nails digging into her palms, trying desperately to keep the tremor of anger from breaking through. Every word that fell from Claire's mouth felt like a slap in itself, and the cold satisfaction in her eyes made Maggie's skin crawl. But still, she stood there, shoulders squared, taking it. Claire's voice lowered again, though her words carried through the space with malicious precision. Honestly, you're so irrelevant now. So old-fashioned. Your success? It's also, well, it's not the kind of thing people care about anymore, is it? The words were like a slow, deliberate poison, and Maggie felt each one land like a weighted stone on her heart. Something inside Maggie snapped, just as she was about to turn, to walk away, to retreat into the shadows where Claire's words couldn't reach her. She felt the familiar presence of Tessa beside her. Her daughter stood close, close enough that Maggie could feel the protective heat radiating from her, but it was more than just physical proximity. It was that quiet, unyielding power that Maggie had seen in Tessa since she was a child. The same power that had led her to the Navy SEALs. The same strength that was always there when Maggie needed it most. Maggie caught a glimpse of Tessa's face. Her daughter's jaw was set, her eyes hard with purpose. In that moment, Maggie knew. She didn't have to say anything. Tessa was no longer going to let this go. Tessa's eyes met Claire's with an intensity that stopped time for just a beat. Claire, too caught up in her own self-absorption, didn't notice the shift. She continued to mock Maggie, oblivious to the impending storm. And then, without another word, Tessa moved. The action was swift, as calculated as any maneuver she'd ever learned in her SEAL training. Tessa's hand shot out, and in a single, flawless motion, her palm met Claire's cheek with a sharp crack that reverberated through the room. The sound was unmistakable, loud enough to steal the breath from everyone nearby. The world seemed to hold its breath in that suspended moment. The instant stretched thin and taut like a wire. The room went dead silent. Tessa stood tall, her posture unwavering, her chest rising and falling with controlled breath. Her gaze locked on Claire's, unflinching. Claire's hand went instinctively to her cheek, her mouth opening in disbelief, but no words came out. Her eyes, wide with shock, flickered between Tessa and Maggie, but she couldn't form a response. For a moment, Maggie thought she might actually hear the hum of air return, the social murmur of the wedding guests resuming their chatter. But no one moved. It was as though the entire world had stopped spinning, caught in the silence that Tessa had created with one powerful gesture. Tessa's voice cut through the stillness, calm but full of authority, her words slicing the air like a blade. "You will never speak to my mother like that again." Her tone was so controlled, so deliberate, that it sent a ripple of unease through the room. There was no hesitation, no fear. She had made her statement, and everyone in the vicinity felt it, like the weight of a command from someone who had earned the right to give it. Claire's mouth opened again, but no words escaped. Instead, her face flushed with a mix of confusion, humiliation, and anger. She glared at Tessa, but Maggie could see the cracks beginning to form in her perfect mask. Claire wasn't used to this kind of resistance. She wasn't used to anyone standing up to her. And Maggie? Maggie felt something shift deep within her, a sense of relief washing over her in a wave. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like the target anymore. She wasn't the one being crushed under Claire's weight. It wasn't her battle to fight alone anymore. The quiet was unbearable. And yet, Maggie didn't look away. Her eyes met Tessa's, and in that moment, she saw everything. The strength, the love, the protection. Her daughter had just claimed something for her that no one had the right to take away. Claire, still reeling, seemed frozen in place. The soft, almost imperceptible tremor in her hands betrayed her shock. But it was her silence, her complete inability to respond, that marked her defeat. The room, still silent, watched, waiting for Claire to reclaim her composure, to do something, anything to save face. But Maggie knew, deep down, that the moment had passed, the power had shifted, and Claire would never have it again. But there was something else in the air now, something that Maggie hadn't anticipated, the whisper of a change that had begun with Tessa's slap. She didn't know where it would lead, but one thing was clear. The battle for her dignity had just begun, and Tessa had drawn the first line in the sand. Maggie stood a little taller. Whatever happened next, she was no longer the quiet, invisible figure in the back of the room. Claire had just made a very dangerous enemy, and now there was no turning back. Noah was there before anyone could fully grasp what had just transpired. He stormed into the small space where Maggie and Tessa stood, his eyes wild with confusion, anger, and a trace of fear. The moment he arrived, everything seemed to stop again, the atmosphere thick with tension. The sharp, almost electric crack of Tessa's slap still echoed in the silence, lingering in the air like a thunderclap. And now Noah's gaze flicked between his wife and his mother as though searching for answers that didn't come easy. "Mom. Tessa." Noah's voice was tight with frustration, the words almost too loud, too jarring for the calm of the moment. He barely looked at Claire, still frozen, her hand pressed to her cheek, eyes glassy with shock. Instead, he turned to Maggie, his expression a mixture of disbelief and accusation. "What the hell is going on here? What did you do?" He looked at Tessa then, his tone hardening, an undercurrent of blame in his voice. Tessa didn't flinch. She stood firm, her posture unwavering, her arms crossed over her chest. Maggie could feel her daughter's quiet strength beside her, the anger and resolve radiating from her like a shield. Noah's words stung, but Tessa remained composed, letting her presence be the answer. Claire was the first to speak, her voice trembling with a thin veneer of indignation, as if her pride had taken the hardest blow. She stepped forward, gingerly touching her reddened cheek, her gaze shifting between Maggie and Tessa with barely restrained venom. She just slapped me," Claire practically hissed, the words a rush of disbelief. "At my own wedding, in front of all these people. She ruined everything." Her voice cracked, but she quickly regained control, her features hardening. "I'm the victim here, Noah. She embarrassed me. Your mother and your sister humiliated me in front of everyone." The sharpness in Claire's voice made Maggie's chest tighten. She had expected this. Expected Claire to twist the situation, to paint herself as the victim even as she had been the one to throw insult after insult. But hearing it spoken so plainly made Maggie's blood run cold. Noah turned to Claire, his face twisted in frustration, clearly torn. His eyes flicked from her to Tessa, then back to Maggie. But there was no resolve in his gaze, only uncertainty. The rift between them, between him and the woman who had been his wife for barely a year, was becoming painfully clear. "Tessa, what the hell were you thinking?" Noah's voice cracked slightly. "You can't just slap someone like that." Tessa met his words with unblinking calm, her jaw tight, her chin held high. "Noah, I didn't do it for me," she said, her voice low and even. "I did it for Mom. You've been letting Claire walk all over her for years. Someone had to step in." Her words hung in the air, thick with accusation, and Noah faltered, his gaze dropping. Maggie watched the conflict in his eyes, a part of him still struggling to reconcile the man he had been with the man Claire had shaped him into. "Mom doesn't deserve this anymore," Tessa continued, her voice quiet but full of conviction. "She's been patient for years, Noah. Too patient. You need to choose. Either you stand by your wife's toxic behavior, or you stand by your family. But you can't keep playing both sides." Maggie's heart swelled with pride, though she kept her face neutral, not wanting to let the emotion show too much. This was her daughter. This was the woman who had always known how to protect what mattered. Noah's eyes snapped to Tessa, and for the first time, there was a flash of something like shame there. But it was fleeting. He turned to Maggie, the confusion still evident in his expression, but there was something else now, too. Something darker, heavier. Maggie's voice broke the silence, steady and clear, though she could feel the tremor in her hands. the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. "Noah," she said, taking a step toward him, her gaze unwavering. "I've been quiet for far too long. I've been pushed around, ignored, and belittled, all for the sake of keeping peace. But that ends now. You've let Claire treat me with contempt. You've let her tear our family apart, and I won't let it go on." Noah's eyes softened, but his lips pressed together in a tight line, and for a moment, Maggie thought he might finally speak the words she'd longed to hear. "I love you," she continued, her voice softer now, but still firm. "But love doesn't mean being treated like you don't matter. I won't be disrespected any longer." Her words were simple, but they were the truth. Noah took a deep breath, his face flushing with the weight of everything unspoken between them. "Mom, He stopped, shaking his head as if trying to clear his thoughts. "I never meant to hurt you." "Noah," Tessa interjected, her voice cutting through the tension. "It's not just about intentions. It's about what's been happening right in front of you. You've watched this happen. You've let it happen. And it's not just your mother you're betraying. It's all of us." For a long moment, no one moved. The guests, who had been watching the scene unfold in stunned silence, began to whisper among themselves, the energy in the room shifting like a heavy fog lifting. Maggie could feel the weight of their eyes on her, on Tessa, but mostly on Claire, who stood there, her cheeks flushed, eyes blazing with barely contained rage. The room was divided. Some guests were still too uncomfortable to speak, but Maggie could see the glances, the subtle nods of understanding, the looks of disapproval aimed at Claire. Even a few of her closest friends seemed to falter in their loyalty, their discomfort palpable. Maggie could feel the shift, feel it in her bones. The tide was turning. Claire's voice finally broke the silence, sharp and bitter. "This isn't over, Maggie," she spat, the venom in her words thick. "You've made a huge mistake." But Maggie didn't flinch. She knew better than to engage with Claire now. She knew that this was no longer about anything Claire could say. It was about something more, something deeper. And as the tension in the room simmered, Maggie felt something else rise within her. A quiet, undeniable strength. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the family she still had, for the future she would no longer let anyone take from her. "Let her talk, Noah," Tessa said, her voice heavy with a kind of finality. "You know who she is now. You don't have to keep listening." Noah didn't answer, but Maggie saw the hesitation, the doubt beginning to settle in his eyes. And for the first time in a long time, Maggie felt like she might just be able to take control of her life again. But it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The sound of heels clicking against the marble floor echoed through the empty hallway as Maggie and Tessa made their way toward the exit. The wedding, once a bright symbol of new beginnings, had become an unbearable weight, and Maggie couldn't help but feel the crushing relief as the door closed behind them, sealing off the chaos within. Tessa's pace was steady, but Maggie noticed the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes remained alert, as though she were still bracing for something. Maggie understood. The storm had passed, but the air was thick with the aftershock. She had just taken a stand in a way she hadn't in years. It felt like a triumph, but also like an open wound. They walked in silence for a few moments before Maggie spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, as though she were speaking the words to herself. "I never thought it would come to this." Tessa, always perceptive, gave her a sidelong glance. "You didn't think you'd have to defend yourself, did you?" Maggie shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "No, I thought I could hold everything together. For Noah. For the family. But I can't anymore." She stopped, her gaze lifting to the night sky outside the venue, the stars distant and cold. What kind of family is this, Tessa? What kind of mother lets her son stand by while his wife insults and belittles her? Tessa didn't respond right away, But Maggie could feel her daughter's understanding, the weight of the unspoken words between them. After a long pause, Tessa finally spoke. "You're not the problem, Mom. You never were." Her voice was steady, but Maggie could hear the echo of her own frustration. Noah has to decide what kind of man he wants to be. And if he chooses to stay on the sidelines, then maybe it's time you stop letting him dictate your peace. Maggie exhaled slowly, her mind racing back to the years of silence, the moments when she had waited for Noah to stand up for her, for him to choose her over Claire's sharp words and icy disregard. But each time, he had hesitated. Each time, he had remained silent. And the weight of that silence had worn her down. "I'm tired of waiting for him to change," Maggie said, her voice low but steady. "Tired of letting him off the hook every time. I should have done this years ago, Tessa. I should have set boundaries long before this wedding, long before Claire came into our lives." Tessa's hand landed gently on her arm, a comforting touch that grounded her. "You've been doing it alone for a long time." "You're not alone now, Mom." Maggie nodded, grateful for her daughter's unwavering support. "No more. I'm not letting him, or her, control my life anymore." They reached the car and Maggie slid into the passenger seat, the cool leather of the seat feeling oddly comforting, as though it were a symbol of the shift she was beginning to make within herself. She fastened her seatbelt, then turned to Tessa, meeting her daughter's eyes. "I have to talk to him, Tessa," Maggie said. "I need to understand why he never stood up for me. I need to know why he let it go on for so long." Her voice trembled with the weight of the question. But she knew it had to be asked. If she didn't understand the why, she'd never be able to move forward, never truly be free of the shadows of the past. Tessa nodded, her expression softening. "I'll be here, no matter what happens." The drive to Noah's house was longer than Maggie remembered, the streets of Seattle slipping past her window in a blur, the city lights flashing like fleeting memories. By the time they arrived, Maggie's nerves were tight, her chest a cage of conflicting emotions. She knew this conversation was inevitable, but that didn't make it any easier. Noah's house, once a place she had hoped would become a home for them both, felt distant now, a fortress that had always stood between them. Maggie's fingers curled around the door handle, but she hesitated. "You're doing the right thing." Tessa's voice was quiet but firm, and Maggie could feel the warmth of her daughter's support, even in the cool night air. With a final, steadying breath, Maggie stepped out of the car, Tessa following closely behind her. The porch light above them flickered as they approached the front door, and Maggie raised her hand to knock, but before she could, the door opened. Noah stood there, his expression guarded, a frown tugging at his lips. The awkward silence between them stretched long enough for Maggie to feel every second of the distance that had come to define their relationship. "Maggie," Noah began, his voice tense. She didn't wait for him to finish. "Noah," Maggie interrupted, her voice steady. "I need to understand. Why haven't you ever stood up for me?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp and raw. Maggie had thought she knew the answer, but hearing it spoken out loud felt like a challenge, a demand for something that had always been denied. She took a step forward, her eyes unwavering. "You've let Claire walk all over me. You've let her disrespect me for years, and you've never said a word." "Why?" Noah's expression shifted, guilt and frustration flickering behind his eyes. He looked like a man who was caught between two worlds, struggling to find a way back to something he couldn't quite name. "I didn't know how to balance it, Mom," Noah admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've always been afraid of her, afraid of what would happen if I stood up to her. You don't understand how angry she gets. I didn't know what else to do." Maggie's heart twisted. Part of her wanted to understand, wanted to empathize. But the hurt of all those years of silence weighed heavily on her. She took a slow, steadying breath. "You don't get it, Noah," she said, her voice hardening. "I'm not some doorstop to be ignored. I'm your mother. And if you can't stand up to her for me, then I'm done pretending it's okay." Tessa's hand found Maggie's once more, the weight of her support a silent but powerful reminder that she wasn't alone. Maggie looked at Noah, seeing the boy she once knew, but also seeing the man who had let so much slip away. "This ends tonight," Maggie said, her decision firm, final. "I'm not doing this anymore. I won't be your second choice." She turned to leave, her hand still gripping Tessa's. The door behind her remained open, but Maggie knew that this conversation wasn't over, and as she stepped into the night, she also knew that something deep inside her had shifted. There was no going back from here. And Noah? He had a choice to make. Maggie's phone buzzed incessantly over the next few days, the persistent sound like an unwelcome echo of her past. She ignored it, most of it. The texts from Noah were carefully worded, the words familiar, almost rehearsed, as if he had spent hours trying to figure out how to explain the betrayal that had lived between them for so long. Each message was an apology, a plea for understanding. But Maggie, deep down, knew it wasn't the apology she was waiting for. The truth was, Noah wasn't apologizing for the years of neglect. He was apologizing for the confrontation. He didn't want her anger. He didn't want the strain on their already fragile relationship. He wasn't standing up for her. He wasn't changing. Maggie didn't respond. Instead, she threw herself into work. Her real estate empire had grown exponentially in the past year, the project she had poured her heart into gaining the recognition it deserved. Investors, high-profile figures, and companies took notice of her grit and determination. Magazine features, interviews, and speaking engagements started to flood in. She was a force in her own right now, and the world was beginning to see her for the powerhouse she had always been. She knew it was the right choice, but still, there were moments, quiet, dark moments, when the weight of Noah's silence pressed in. He hadn't called. He hadn't even tried to reach out after the last conversation. He had simply disappeared, swallowed up by the world Claire had built for him, a world where Maggie had no place. And then there was Claire. Claire's interference started small, almost imperceptible at first. A casual mention of Maggie's name at social events, an attempt to stir gossip. Little jabs here and there about Maggie's business dealings, her outdated style, her way of running things, as if she had the right to mock Maggie for the very qualities that had made her successful. As if the life Maggie had worked for, built from the ground up, wasn't worth anything at all. Claire had always been the type to create chaos just for the sake of it, and now that Maggie had pulled away, Claire was trying to reclaim control over what she thought was hers, Noah, and by extension, the family. She began showing up at the same high society events, trying to make her presence known, inserting herself into business meetings, even hinting at new projects that could benefit from her involvement. Projects Maggie had already been offered, mind you, but Claire was determined to get her claws into everything Maggie had built. She played the victim with Noah, making sure to tell him how hurt she was by Maggie's refusal to accept her place in the family. Maggie noticed all of it. She saw the thinly veiled attempts at sabotage. But she wasn't going to play that game. Not anymore. Every time Claire's name came up, every whisper in the business world or social circle, Maggie stood firm. She refused to be cowed by the underhanded tactics. She refused to shrink into the shadows again, to become the woman who apologized for things that weren't her fault. She wasn't the one who had betrayed trust. She wasn't the one who had let things slide for far too long. Tessa, ever vigilant, was right there with her. She showed up at every event, kept an eye on the family's dynamics, and refused to let anyone, least of all Claire, get under Maggie's skin again. Tessa had become her rock, her protector, but also her cheerleader. It wasn't just about fighting the battles anymore. It was about rebuilding, about growing beyond the constraints that Noah and Claire had placed on her for so long. "I'm proud of you," Tessa said one evening, watching Maggie prepare for another high-stakes business meeting. "You've come so far, Mom. You're finally living for you." Maggie smiled, the warmth in her daughter's words settling deep inside her. But there was a tightness in her chest as she thought about Noah. Was he proud of her? Did he even know what she had done? Or had he already accepted the narrative Claire had spun for him? The phone buzzed again. This time, it was Noah. "Mom, please, can we talk? I'm trying, but I don't know how to fix things with you." Maggie stared at the message. The words were familiar, yet empty. Another attempt at reconciliation. But Noah wasn't really trying to fix anything, was he? He was trying to ease his own guilt, trying to assuage the pressure that came with the uncomfortable knowledge that he had chosen the wrong side all these years. Her thumb hovered over the reply button, but instead of typing, she locked the phone and set it down on the counter. She didn't need this anymore. She didn't need him to validate her. She didn't need to justify her choices. She had spent too many years waiting for someone else to take charge of her happiness, waiting for someone else to stand up for her. But now, she was in control. She was finally the one who decided. And yet, a part of her felt the sting of absence. It was always going to be there, the space Noah had left behind, the gap that Claire had created. She couldn't just wish it away, but she was strong enough to stand without them now. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Maggie's business continued to grow, gaining more recognition with every passing month. She started new philanthropic initiatives focused on empowering women in leadership roles, especially those who had been overlooked or marginalized. She spoke at international summits and mentored young entrepreneurs who looked to her as a beacon of resilience. In the midst of it all, Noah's frustration with his marriage became evident. He reached out again, but this time, Maggie didn't even open the message. She couldn't keep playing this game, couldn't keep letting him come and go as he pleased, pretending that their relationship was something it wasn't. Noah had to make a choice. And for Maggie, the choice had already been made. She had chosen herself. But even as she moved forward, there was still a piece of her that wondered if it was truly the end, or if the story was only beginning. The pieces of the family she had once held together were shattered now, scattered beyond her reach. And while she was no longer waiting for Noah to put them back together, she couldn't shake the feeling that the past might one day catch up with her. But for now, she could only keep moving forward. The future was hers to create. The lights of the summit were blinding, the grand hall filled with voices, the clink of glasses, and the buzz of anticipation. Maggie stood backstage, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. The world was watching, and for the first time in years, it felt right. She had fought for this moment, fought through silence, humiliation, and years of invisibility. Now, it was her time to be seen, to speak, to claim the success that had always been waiting for her. When they called her name, a ripple of energy passed through her. The audience stood and applauded, and for a brief moment Maggie felt like she had entered a different world, a world where she was no longer the quiet woman waiting in the wings. She walked onto the stage, the lights shining brightly, but all she could focus on was the sea of faces before her. There were no distractions now. No Claire, no Noah, just her, and the story she was about to tell. She took a deep breath, settling into the microphone. "I've spent too many years trying to fit into someone else's version of success," Maggie began, her voice steady but raw. "I let my life be defined by the expectations of others, by the weight of their judgment. But in the end, the one person I forgot to answer to was myself." The crowd was silent, listening intently. Maggie felt a shiver run down her spine. This was it. This was the truth. raw, and unfiltered. I was raised to believe that being strong meant holding everything together, even when it felt like it was falling apart. But strength doesn't mean being invisible. It means standing tall, even when no one else will. Her words resonated with the crowd, the truth of her struggle connecting with their own experiences. Women in the audience nodded. Others wiped tears away. Maggie's story, her journey of resilience, was no longer just her own. It was a story that belonged to millions of people who had been overlooked, belittled, and dismissed. She paused, letting the weight of her words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. For years, I let myself be second. I let myself be the afterthought. But I won't do that anymore. I won't let anyone else define my worth. The applause that followed was overwhelming. Maggie stood tall, feeling the tide of approval rush over her. But it wasn't the applause she needed. It was the acknowledgement, the recognition of her own worth, her strength, her fight. As she stepped off the stage, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen, half expecting it to be another message from Noah, another feeble attempt at reconciliation. But it wasn't. It was a social media post. One of the summit's organizers had posted her speech online, and it had already gone viral. Comments poured in, thousands of people sharing her message, echoing her story. "Thank you for giving me a voice I didn't know I needed. Your story is my story. You've changed the way I see myself." For the first time in a long time, Maggie realized the scale of her impact. Her words had touched a chord, had sparked a movement. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. Her success didn't just come from the high-profile business deals, the recognition in her industry, or the partnerships she was securing with major international companies. It came from the way her story connected with people, real people, who had been waiting for someone to speak for them. It was her own evolution, her growth into the woman she had always been capable of becoming. But Noah's absence loomed large. Maggie knew, deep down, that her son was struggling. She had heard whispers from mutual friends, and although she tried not to listen, she couldn't escape the truth. His marriage to Claire, which had once seemed like a fairy tale, was unraveling. Noah had reached out to Maggie a few more times, but each message was more desperate than the last, more filled with regret. The man he had become, the man who had stayed silent for so long, was no longer the son she knew. He was lost in a web of guilt, confusion, and fear. His relationship with Claire had turned toxic. Claire's manipulative behavior had started to show cracks, pushing Noah further away, even as she clung to him. Claire, always calculating, had made sure to keep her claws deep in Noah's life, controlling every aspect of it, even his relationship with his mother. Maggie could feel it in her bones. Noah wanted to reach out, but the pressure from Claire was too much. He wasn't just a husband anymore. He was a prisoner to Claire's toxic grip. As the summit ended, Maggie was approached by several influential women who had been moved by her speech. They were eager to collaborate, to create more spaces for women to rise, to have their voices heard. Maggie felt a rush of excitement as she discussed new projects, philanthropic ventures focusing on women's empowerment, on creating leadership pipelines, on helping women who had been overlooked to find their place at the table. Tessa was by her side, her support unwavering as always. She was no longer just Maggie's daughter. Tessa had stepped into her own leadership role, her career in the Navy gaining recognition as she fought for gender equality in her field. She, too, was becoming a symbol of strength, a beacon of what it meant to rise against the odds. Tessa had always known what it meant to stand up for what was right, to stand by her family, and now, she was becoming a public figure in her own right. Her loyalty to Maggie, her fierce protectiveness, was becoming a force that could not be ignored. Maggie smiled as she watched Tessa speak with some of the other women. She had never felt prouder. But as she stood there, basking in the glow of her success, there was still that lingering thought, that quiet ache. Was Noah ever going to break free from the woman who had trapped him? Noah, in his silence, had made his choice. But Claire, as always, was trying to rewrite their story. Maggie didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. Whatever came, she would face it head on. She had already chosen herself. And the world was watching. As she walked into the future with the weight of her own success behind her, Maggie knew the battle wasn't over. The final chapter of this story had yet to be written, and it would be hers to write. The phone buzzed again. Another message from Noah. Maggie had learned to ignore the notifications, the steady stream of texts that came, each one filled with more regret than the last. But today, something about the message caught her eye. It was different this time. "Mom, I need to talk to you. Please. I can't do this anymore. I'm so sorry for everything." She stared at the screen for a long time, her thumb hovering over the reply button. Noah's apology was nothing new. He had apologized before, over and over, but this one felt different, more desperate, more raw. She could almost hear his voice in her head, his struggle, the turmoil he was in. She could feel the guilt, the shame radiating from the words. But Maggie had long since stopped waiting for his change. Noah had made his choices, and each one had led him further away from her. She had stopped needing his approval a long time ago. Yet, as she read the words again, she felt the pull of motherhood, that deep, aching need to fix things, to heal the rift between them. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "I can't do this anymore, Noah." The words she wanted to say felt like a weight in her chest, but they had to be said. She had already let too much slide. She had given him enough time, enough chances. Maggie hesitated, then typed her response. "Noah, I love you, but I cannot be part of a family where I am disrespected. For years I let it go, hoping you would change, hoping you would choose me over her. But you didn't. And now, it's too late. I can't do this anymore." She stared at the screen, watching the message appear before her. When it was sent, it felt final. More final than any door closing behind her. She wasn't sure if he would ever understand, but she had come too far to take it back. Noah had to choose. He had always been stuck between two worlds, his wife and his mother, and now it was on him to figure out where his loyalty lay. The days that followed were a blur of business meetings, public appearances, and more accolades. Maggie was no longer the woman who hesitated. She was a force in her own right, her story of overcoming adversity continuing to resonate with the public. Her business empire expanded, and her philanthropic efforts took root, gaining support from influential women around the globe. Her work on women's empowerment found new platforms as she spoke at international summits, traveled across continents, and gained followers who were eager to hear her message. Her influence was undeniable. Maggie had become a symbol of what it meant to reclaim control, to refuse to let others define her. And with every new project, every new opportunity, the void left by Noah's absence seemed to shrink just a little more. But there were moments when she would catch herself in the quiet spaces between events, when she would think about him, about Noah. She couldn't help it. He was her son, and despite everything, she still loved him. But that love, as strong as it was, could no longer overpower the hurt he had caused. He had let Claire's toxicity consume him, and Maggie couldn't let herself drown in the ripples of their broken family. Meanwhile, Noah's marriage to Claire continued to deteriorate. Maggie had heard bits and pieces through friends, through the social grapevine. Claire's temper was worsening, her sharp edges more pronounced as she tried to cling to whatever shred of control she had over Noah. She had already alienated him from his mother. Now she was working on eroding what little he had left of himself. Maggie could see the signs. Noah was suffocating under Claire's constant need for control, her manipulative ways leaving him more and more lost. He was constantly second-guessing himself, caught in a cycle of guilt and confusion, unable to make a decision that wouldn't result in Claire's wrath. He had reached out to Maggie again, a few days after her message, but the words he sent felt hollow. There was no resolve in them, just more of the same self-pity and apologies. "Please, Mom, I don't know how to fix this." Maggie didn't respond. She had already made her peace with the fact that Noah might never break free from Claire. She wasn't going to wait around, hoping he would. Not anymore. She had done the hard work of rebuilding herself, of growing beyond the version of herself that had been caught in their web of dysfunction. She wasn't going back. Tessa, meanwhile, was continuing to rise through the ranks of the Navy, her own story of resilience taking shape. She had become a public figure in her own right, one who not only fought for gender equality within the military, but also advocated for women everywhere who had been silenced, overlooked, or underestimated. Tessa's leadership had earned her accolades, and Maggie couldn't help but feel a swell of pride every time she saw her daughter's name in the press. Tessa had always been the protector, the one who stood by Maggie through everything. But now, she was more than that. Tessa was a force in her own right, a woman who was carving out her own path and making it known that women were a force to be reckoned with. Maggie spent her time traveling the world, speaking on panels, meeting with other changemakers, and using her platform to make real, lasting change. She focused on the work that mattered, on the initiatives that empowered women to rise and lead, on creating spaces for them to find their voice. She didn't need Noah's approval. She didn't need anyone's approval. She had built this life, this future, for herself, and the world was finally noticing. Yet, every now and then her thoughts would drift back to Noah, wondering if he was still trapped in Claire's web, wondering if he would ever truly break free. But Maggie wasn't waiting for him anymore. The world was hers now, and she was going to make it count. Maggie had spent days pacing her apartment, staring out the windows at the city below, her mind running in circles. Noah's apology had shaken something deep within her, even though she'd sworn she wouldn't respond. And yet, here she was, standing at the door of his house again, her hand hovering over the handle as the memories of years past, the pain, the betrayal, the silence, washed over her. Noah had asked to meet. She had said yes, but only on her terms. She wasn't about to walk back into the same trap she'd been in for so long. She had to see for herself if Noah was truly ready to change, or if he was simply caught up in the aftermath of Claire's manipulation. The door opened slowly, and Noah stood there, a shadow of the man she had once known. He had lost weight. His face was drawn, weary from sleepless nights and too many battles with himself. He looked different, smaller, more broken, but there was something in his eyes that told her he was finally ready to face the truth. "Maggie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for coming. I've been thinking about this moment for so long." Maggie didn't speak right away. She stepped inside, but her eyes never left his. She had no interest in pleasantries, no interest in hearing the same apologies she'd heard too many times before. She needed him to own what had happened, to understand the depth of the damage caused. "Sit down, Noah," she said, her voice steady but firm. They both sat across from each other, the space between them heavy with years of silence and unspoken words. Noah shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands clenched in his lap. "I was wrong, Maggie," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I let Claire come between us. I let her control me, and I was too weak to stand up for you. I can't believe how much time I wasted, how much I let you down. I should have been there for you." Maggie closed her eyes briefly, the pain of the past rushing back. She had wanted him to say these words for so long, wanted him to finally take responsibility for the choices he'd made. But now that they were spoken, the words didn't feel like a healing balm. They felt like a reminder of everything she had endured. "I know," she said softly. "I've heard it all before. But the truth is, Noah, it doesn't matter anymore. You can't just say, 'I'm sorry,' and expect things to go back to the way they were." Noah's eyes flickered with hurt, but he didn't interrupt. He understood now that this wasn't just about words. It was about actions. It was about trust, something that had been fractured beyond repair. "I know," he said, his voice barely audible. "But I don't want to lose you. I can't lose you, Maggie." She met his gaze, her heart heavy but resolute. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Noah. I'm asking for my own peace of mind. I need to forgive you for me, not for you. I need to move forward without carrying the weight of your choices." Noah nodded slowly, as if the truth of her words were sinking in, piece by piece. "I understand. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I want to try. I want to rebuild what we had, even if it's different. I just don't want to lose you completely." Maggie took a deep breath, the air thick with the tension of their years apart. "We can start again, but on my terms. I'm not going to be part of a family where I'm still treated like an afterthought, Noah. There will be boundaries, clear boundaries, and I won't let Claire's influence control us anymore." He nodded again, his face lined with regret, but also with the beginnings of something else. Hope, perhaps. It wasn't enough to erase the years of pain, but it was a start. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, his voice steady. "I'll fight for us." Maggie felt a flicker of something. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was just relief that the conversation was finally happening. But she didn't allow herself to linger on it. She had spent too long waiting for Noah to change. Now, it was about moving forward, about reclaiming her life, her peace, her own sense of self-worth. "You can't do it for me, Noah," she said, her voice softer but no less firm. "You have to do it for yourself." For a long moment, there was silence between them. Maggie could hear the weight of Noah's internal struggle, but she wasn't going to carry it for him. That was his battle to fight now. "I know," Noah said quietly, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "I will. I promise." Later that day, Maggie met Tessa at a local cafe, a place they had gone to many times over the years to talk, to share, to plan. Tessa was already sitting at a table by the window, her expression unreadable. But Maggie could see the way her daughter held herself, strong, steady, and resolute, just like always. "Did you talk to him?" Tessa asked, her voice even, not pushing, but waiting. Maggie sat down, her eyes meeting her daughter's. She had expected this conversation to be difficult, but the weight of the day had already settled within her. "I did," Maggie said, her voice quieter now. "We talked. He's sorry. He admitted he was wrong, but it's going to take time, and I need to make sure I'm not sacrificing my peace for anyone anymore. Not even him." Tessa nodded, her eyes softening. "You're doing the right thing, Mom. You always have been." Maggie felt a rush of gratitude for her daughter, for the unwavering support she had given her, for the strength she had shown when Maggie needed it the most. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the people outside the cafe walk by. Maggie knew there would be more challenges ahead. She knew that Noah's path to healing wouldn't be easy, and Claire's grip on him wouldn't loosen easily. But for the first time in years, Maggie felt like she had reclaimed something of herself that had been lost. The road ahead was uncertain, but Maggie wasn't afraid. She had learned that her future was something she could control, something she could shape with her own hands. And as the afternoon sun streamed through the cafe window, Maggie felt the stirring of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The story wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The tension between Noah and Claire had become palpable. It was no longer just an undercurrent. It was an unspoken force that colored everything they did. Maggie could feel it every time Noah visited her. His once light demeanor now weighed down by the guilt that seemed to follow him like a shadow. He would sit in her office, shoulders slumped, eyes darting around the room as though looking for an escape from the turmoil that clung to him. The messages between them were sporadic, mostly about trivial things at first: business advice, casual pleasantries, but over time, they had evolved into more personal discussions. Noah would sit across from Maggie, leaning forward, his voice barely above a whisper. He was trying to get her back into his life, not as his mother, but as someone who could help him navigate the wreckage of his own making. "I don't know what to do anymore, Mom," he had said during one of their conversations, his face drawn tight with the strain of his marriage to Claire. "I feel like I'm drowning. She keeps pulling me in different directions, and I'm stuck." Maggie didn't respond immediately. She had learned to sit with the silence, to let the weight of his words settle without jumping to offer comfort. The old Maggie would have scrambled to make everything okay, but that Maggie was gone. The woman before him now knew that the only person she could truly save was herself. "You're going to have to make a decision, Noah," she said softly. "You can't keep living in two worlds. You're either going to keep sacrificing yourself for Claire, or you're going to step out of that toxic space and choose a different path." He looked at her, eyes searching for a sign that she would save him. But Maggie wasn't going to give that to him anymore. She had learned the hard way that some battles weren't hers to fight. "I can't tell you what to do," she continued. "But I can tell you this: I won't be part of your misery anymore." Noah nodded, his shoulders heavy with the weight of her words. It was clear he was torn, still caught in the pull of Claire's control. But Maggie had learned that she couldn't let that kind of indecision dictate her own happiness anymore. Maggie's life had changed in ways she couldn't have imagined a year ago. She had focused on her own growth, building not only her business empire, but also a network of women who looked to her as a mentor and a beacon of strength. She had become a sought-after speaker, traveling the world, giving talks on leadership, resilience, and overcoming adversity. Her name had become synonymous with empowerment, not just in the business world, but also in philanthropy. With each partnership she formed, with each new project, Maggie felt herself grow stronger. She was no longer at the mercy of anyone else's expectations. She was the architect of her own destiny, and she had built something strong and lasting. Her real estate company continued to thrive, and the strategic partnerships she'd made with international companies ensured her empire would stand tall for years to come. But it wasn't just about wealth, it was about impact. She poured herself into causes that mattered to her: women's rights, education for underprivileged girls, leadership training for young women. She mentored entrepreneurs, giving them the tools they needed to succeed in a world that often overlooked them. She had built this life, and it felt like the first time in years that everything was finally in alignment. Tessa, too, was thriving. The Navy had become more than just a career for her. It was a calling. Her leadership had earned her accolades, but it was her refusal to back down from fighting for equality within the ranks that truly set her apart. She was now in a leadership role herself, a commanding officer in a male-dominated space, and she was taking on projects aimed at improving the lives of women soldiers, advocating for equal opportunities, and encouraging other women to take charge of their careers. Tessa had always been Maggie's protector, the one who made sure her mother was safe and seen. But now, Tessa had become her own force, a woman who had found her own voice and was using it to create change. "I'm working on something big," Tessa said one evening, excitement in her voice. A book about leadership and resilience, specifically for women in the military. Maggie's heart swelled with pride. I think it's a brilliant idea, Tess. You've lived it. You've fought for it every day. I want to show them that leadership isn't just about being in charge. Tessa continued, her eyes alight with passion. It's about understanding that strength comes from within, not from anyone else's approval. Maggie nodded. Her daughter had learned everything she needed to know from the very best, herself. It had taken years, but Tessa had found her own power, and Maggie knew that Tessa would use it to pave the way for future generations of women. And so, Maggie's life continued to unfold, layer by layer, each one stronger, more authentic, more fulfilling than the last. She had rebuilt herself from the ground up, and while the road to this point had been full of loss, heartache, and disappointment, it had also been full of growth and triumph. She was no longer bound by the past. She was creating the future. But even as she moved forward, there were still moments when Noah would call, asking for advice, asking for help. He was still lost, still fighting the pull of his crumbling marriage, still unsure where his loyalty lay. It was heartbreaking to see him struggle, but Maggie knew that the best thing she could do for him now was to let him find his own way. She wasn't going to keep sacrificing her happiness for his indecision. I'm here for you, Noah, she told him one night, her voice steady. But I won't be part of your suffering anymore. You have to decide what you want, and then you have to live with it. And so, she did. Maggie had chosen her own path, one that was full of purpose, passion, and empowerment. She had stopped waiting for anyone else to define her, stopped hoping for things to change. She had created the life she had always dreamed of. The future, she realized, wasn't something that happened to her. It was something she built with her own hands. And now, with the foundation of her life stronger than ever, there was nothing she couldn't do. The journey ahead was hers to shape. Maggie knew it was coming. She'd felt it in the air for weeks now. The slow burn of Claire's resentment, the simmering fury beneath the surface. Claire had never been one to accept defeat gracefully, and Maggie had made it clear she wasn't going to be the victim of her manipulation any longer. So when Claire called, her voice tight with something dangerously close to disdain, Maggie wasn't surprised. She knew exactly what this was about. I need to see you, Maggie. Claire's voice crackled through the phone, sharp and commanding. Now. Maggie didn't hesitate. She wasn't going to let Claire drag this out any longer. I'll meet you at your place in an hour, Maggie said, her tone calm but firm. The moment Maggie arrived at Claire's home, she could feel the tension in the air. The walls were colder than she remembered, a clear reflection of the hostility between them. Claire stood in the living room, her arms crossed, a forced smile on her lips that did nothing to hide the venom behind her eyes. You think you've won, don't you? Claire began, her voice dripping with bitterness. You've built your little empire. You've gotten everything you've ever wanted, all at the expense of Noah and me. But you haven't won anything, Maggie. You've just torn this family apart. Maggie didn't flinch. She had heard Claire's words and she wasn't about to be manipulated again. I didn't tear anything apart, Claire. You did that long before I even stepped into the picture. You used Noah, you used me, and now you're trying to twist everything to make yourself the victim. But it's over. I won't let you control me, or my son, or anyone else in my life anymore. Claire's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Maggie could see the familiar flash of anger, no longer masked by the polished facade Claire had spent years perfecting. You think you're so much better than me? Claire spat, stepping closer. But you're nothing without Noah, without his money, his connections. You can pretend all you want that you're something else, but I know the truth. You're a nobody, and you'll always be second to me. Maggie took a step forward, closing the distance between them. The energy in the room shifted, thick with tension. She could feel the weight of the years of manipulation, of silence, of resentment, but she wasn't backing down now. "No, Claire," Maggie said, her voice strong and unwavering. "I'm not second to anyone anymore. Not to you, not to Noah. I built my life, and I'll continue to build it without your approval or anyone else's. You've lost. You've already lost everything you cared about. Your hold on Noah is slipping. He's finally starting to see you for who you are." Claire's expression faltered for the briefest moment before her rage flared up again. "You think Noah will ever choose you over me? You really think that? He's mine. He always has been. And I'll make sure he never goes back to you." Maggie shook her head, the weight of years of silence lifting from her shoulders. "No, Claire. You've already lost him. He's finally seeing through your lies, through your manipulation. And for the first time in years, he's starting to make his own choices. You've worn him down, but you can't keep him forever. Not anymore." There was a long silence, a moment where Claire's eyes widened, and for the first time, Maggie saw a crack in her armor. She wasn't the powerful force she'd always pretended to be. She was desperate, vulnerable. Claire opened her mouth to speak, but Maggie cut her off. "And I'm not going anywhere. I'm not leaving Noah. If he wants to rebuild our relationship, he'll do it on his own terms. Not because of you. Not because of your guilt trips. Not anymore. I'm done being manipulated." As Maggie turned to leave, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. It was Noah. He had arrived, just in time to hear everything Claire had to say, to see the truth of his mother's strength and resilience. Noah stepped into the room, his face conflicted, torn between the two women he loved but had been unable to choose between for far too long. He looked at Maggie, then at Claire, the weight of everything pressing down on him. "Mom, Claire." His voice broke, the strain evident in his eyes. Maggie looked at him, her gaze steady, her heart open, but not for the first time, guarded. "Noah," she said gently, "you have to decide. You have to choose who you want to be. I can't carry this burden for you anymore." Claire's face twisted, fury rising, and she took a step forward. "Noah, don't listen to her. She's been manipulating you for years. She's always been the one to push you away from me. Don't let her tear us apart. You know you belong with me." Noah stood frozen for a moment, caught between them, his eyes darting back and forth. Then, something in his face shifted, something that hadn't been there before. A realization, a sense of clarity. He turned to Claire, his voice steady but filled with sadness. "No, I can't do this anymore, Claire. I've been afraid for so long, but I can't keep living this lie. I see what you've done. I see how you've controlled me, how you've pushed my family away. I can't be part of this anymore." Claire's expression darkened, her manipulation finally failing her. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she turned on her heel, storming out of the room, leaving Noah and Maggie alone. Noah turned to Maggie, his face filled with remorse. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I was blind. I didn't see it before. But I see it now. I see everything you've been trying to tell me." Maggie felt a mixture of relief and pain. This moment had taken years to arrive, but she could finally feel the burden of their fractured relationship lifting. "It's not about what you see now, Noah," she said softly. "It's about what you do with that truth. I'm here, but only if you choose to respect yourself and the people who truly care about you." Noah nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude, his voice steady. "I'll do better. I promise." Tessa, standing at the door, her arms crossed, stepped in. "You should," she said firmly, her voice full of conviction. "You don't just get to come back into her life. You have to earn it." Maggie looked at Tessa, pride swelling in her chest. Her daughter had always been her protector, but now, Tessa was more than that. She was her ally, her equal. Together, they were stronger than ever. The journey to rebuild hadn't ended yet, but for the first time in a long while, Maggie felt like she had finally reclaimed everything that mattered. The last pieces of her life were falling into place, not because of Noah's decision, but because she had finally learned to live life on her terms. As Claire retreated into the shadows of her own making, Maggie walked forward, ready to embrace the future, ready to rebuild the family she had always fought for, and in the process, finally reclaim the respect she deserved. The battle was over. The victory was hers. Maggie stood at the top of the stage, the lights shining down on her, the vast sea of faces before her a blur. The hum of the audience's murmurs settled into an expectant silence, and for the first time in years, Maggie felt fully in control. This was her moment, one she had earned, fought for, and built from the ground up. She adjusted the microphone, her hand steady, her voice unwavering. I spent years hiding from my own power, waiting for others to approve of me, to give me permission to step into the life I was meant to lead. But what I've learned is that no one can give you that permission. You have to claim it for yourself. Her words echoed through the room, their resonance underscoring the truth of her journey. Maggie was no longer the woman on the sidelines, the one who had once been quieted by the voices around her. She was the voice now. She was the one leading the charge. The crowd erupted into applause, and Maggie allowed herself a brief, quiet smile. It was more than just recognition. It was validation, not from anyone else, but from herself. She had done this. She had overcome everything that had once held her back. Maggie's empire was soaring. Her real estate company was now a global powerhouse, with projects spanning continents. Her influence reached far beyond the walls of her office or the stages she spoke on. It had become a symbol of resilience, of reinvention, of what it meant to build something from nothing. But Maggie knew that her success wasn't defined by her wealth or accolades. It was defined by the impact she had on the lives of others. And so, she poured her heart into her philanthropy, into causes that mattered most to her. Women's leadership, mentorship, giving young women the tools to rise above the challenges they faced. Her story of resilience became her calling card. She had been a quiet woman in the shadows, and now she was a global advocate for women's rights, speaking at forums, leading panels, and mentoring the next generation of women leaders. Maggie was everywhere, not because she sought fame, but because her message resonated deeply with so many. She had fought her way to the top, and now she was showing others how they could do the same. Her memoir, Reclaimed, The Power of Forgiveness and Self-Belief, was published with overwhelming success. It became an instant bestseller, lauded for its raw honesty and its unflinching portrayal of the struggles Maggie had endured. Her journey from the ashes of her past to the heights of success became a beacon for those who had been dismissed, overlooked, and underestimated. The book was more than just a story. It was a lifeline, an invitation for anyone who had ever doubted their own power to step into the light. The media outlets came calling, and Maggie was soon a familiar face at global forums, sharing her story and offering advice to budding entrepreneurs, women in leadership, and anyone looking to break through the glass ceiling. Her story was now theirs too. Her struggles, her triumphs, her reinvention. Maggie had become a symbol of what was possible when you refused to stay down. As Maggie's influence continued to grow, Tessa's career in the military was gaining similar recognition. Her rise through the ranks was nothing short of extraordinary, but it wasn't just her military achievements that set her apart. It was her advocacy for gender equality within the Navy, her work to ensure that women had equal opportunities to lead and to succeed. Tessa had become a voice for women in the military, and her platform was now powerful enough to influence real change. "I'm working on something big," Tessa said one evening, excitement in her voice as they sat together at dinner. A project that will reshape how women in the military are seen and how they see themselves. I'm writing a book about leadership, about resilience, about finding your strength, even when the odds are stacked against you. Maggie couldn't contain her pride. That's incredible, Tess. You're going to change so many lives. I want them to know that leadership isn't about power over others. It's about strength within yourself. It's about knowing who you are and standing firm in that. It's about lifting up everyone around you, not tearing them down. Maggie smiled, seeing so much of herself in her daughter's words. Tessa had found her own voice, and now she was passing that gift on to others. In the months that followed, Maggie continued to work tirelessly on her business ventures, but she never lost sight of the causes she cared about. She established a scholarship fund for young women pursuing careers in leadership, particularly in male-dominated fields. She knew what it felt like to be overlooked, to have to fight for every inch of space. This scholarship wasn't just financial aid. It was a chance for women to find their footing, to believe in their own worth, and to carve out a space where their voices could be heard. The foundation for her legacy was being laid, brick by brick, and Maggie knew that she was not just changing the world for herself, but for generations to come. But the most rewarding part of it all was the personal growth she experienced. Maggie no longer defined herself by her past mistakes or by the expectations of others. She had stepped into her own power, and every day, she proved to herself that she was enough. She was enough. One evening, as she sat on the balcony of her penthouse, overlooking the city lights below, Maggie reflected on everything she had built, the relationships she had mended, the empire she had created, the woman she had become. The road had been long and filled with struggle, but every step had led her to this moment of peace, of self-realization. She had fought for everything in her life, and now she was living the life she had always dreamed of. Maggie's journey wasn't over. There would always be more to do, more to achieve, more lives to touch. But as she looked at the stars above, she knew that she had finally created the legacy she had always deserved. And as her phone buzzed with another request for an interview, Maggie knew that this was just the beginning. The world was waiting for her next move, and she was more than ready to show them what came next. The future was hers to create. The room was filled with applause, the kind that rolled over Maggie like a wave, warm, welcoming, but still humbling. The Lifetime Achievement Award gleamed in her hands, its polished surface catching the light as she stepped up to the stage. Her heart beat in her chest, not with nerves but with a deep, satisfying sense of accomplishment. This moment, this recognition, was the culmination of everything she had worked for. But it wasn't just the award, it was what it represented. As Maggie stood before the crowd of influential women from around the globe, she realized this wasn't just about her success. It was about all the women who had struggled like her, who had fought to carve out a place in a world that had long told them they didn't belong. It was for every woman who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or silenced. This moment was theirs too. She took a steadying breath, letting the applause wash over her before stepping into the spotlight. The microphone felt like an extension of herself now, something she had held in her hands countless times, but this time, it was different. This was the moment when her story was shared with the world, her voice reverberating beyond the walls of the room. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady but full of emotion. "When I started this journey, I had no idea where it would lead. I didn't start out to be a leader. I started out just trying to survive. I was just a woman, no more, no less, who had been told time and time again that I wasn't enough. But today, standing here, I know that my story, my journey, is proof that resilience is the key to success. The audience was hanging on her every word, and for the first time, Maggie realized just how far she had come. She wasn't just standing in front of them as a successful businesswoman. She was standing there as a beacon of possibility, a testament to the power of fighting for yourself, no matter the odds. For decades, I allowed others to define me, what I should be, what I could do, how much I was worth. But I learned that no one has the right to define your worth except for you. And that, my friends, is the most important lesson I've learned in my life. Maggie paused, looking out at the sea of faces before her. She could feel the energy in the room, an unspoken understanding, a collective breath, as if everyone there knew what she meant. She had fought for her space, her voice, and now she was using it to empower others. Success doesn't come from the accolades or the money. Success comes from the strength to keep going when the world tells you to stop. Success comes from the courage to believe in yourself, even when no one else does. And success comes from lifting each other up, from ensuring that no one is left behind. As she spoke, Maggie felt a hand slip into hers. Tessa, standing at her side, her face full of pride, her posture radiating confidence, had joined her on stage. Her daughter, a woman who had built her own path, who was a leader in her own right, stood beside her, unwavering, strong, and proud. Tessa's presence was the punctuation to Maggie's speech. It was the final proof that everything Maggie had fought for had been worth it. Not just for herself, but for the next generation, for Tessa, for all the women who would follow in their footsteps. The applause was thunderous now, echoing through the hall. Maggie's heart swelled with pride as she glanced down at Tessa, her daughter's smile lighting up the room. They had come a long way together. And Maggie knew, deep in her bones, that this was just the beginning. As Maggie stepped down from the stage, she felt the weight of the award in her hands, but it wasn't heavy. It was light. She had earned it, not just with her work, but with her heart, with the way she had lived her truth, even when it seemed impossible. She caught a glimpse of Noah in the crowd. He had been sitting near the back, quietly watching her, and when their eyes met, there was no bitterness, no resentment, only a silent understanding. He had come a long way, too. The road ahead for him was still uncertain, but Maggie knew, deep in her heart, that his journey had started to align with his truth, just as hers had. Noah had changed. She could see it in the way he held himself, the way he looked at her. It was clear that he was starting to understand the power of the choices he had made, and the consequences of those choices. But that wasn't her fight anymore. She had fought her battles, and now it was time for him to find his own way. But as Maggie stood with Tessa by her side, she didn't dwell on the past. The moment was hers to embrace. She had earned this recognition, and while it was a reminder of how far she had come, it was also a reminder of the impact she would continue to make. Her legacy was being created, one brick at a time, not just for her family, but for the generations that would follow. And just as the awards ceremony was winding down, Maggie found herself pulled aside by a group of women who had been deeply moved by her speech. They wanted to know more, to learn from her, to hear the stories behind the victories. They wanted her wisdom, her advice, her guidance. Maggie smiled, her heart full, as she realized that this was what mattered most. Not the fame or the fortune, but the ability to create lasting change, to give others the courage to stand up and fight for what they deserved. As Tessa joined her, the two women stood together, stronger than ever, their futures intertwined, their legacies already in motion. And for Maggie, the road ahead had never been clearer. Her journey had just begun. The evening was quieter than usual when Noah called. Maggie had been standing by the window of her penthouse, watching the city pulse with life below. Her phone buzzed once, and her heart caught for a moment. She had learned to stop expecting immediate resolution from Noah, but tonight felt different. She took a deep breath and answered, "Mom, I need to talk to you," Noah said, his voice tentative, but there was something deeper beneath the words, something real this time. Maggie sat down, her back straight, the weight of her past no longer burdening her. "I'm listening. I know I've hurt you, and I regret the years of silence," Noah admitted, the words heavy but honest. "I know I've failed you as a son and as a father, but I'm trying to make things right. I want to rebuild what I broke. I know I can never undo it, but I need to try." Maggie nodded, her heart softening, but she held her ground. She had been here before, listening to his apologies, feeling the hollow promises in his voice. This time, though, was different. She wasn't waiting for him to fix her, or to make her whole again. She was whole on her own. "I've been through a lot, Noah," she said calmly, her tone firm but not unkind. "I've had to rebuild my own life, piece by piece. I've learned that my worth isn't tied to your approval, or anyone else's for that matter. You've got to earn back my trust. But more importantly, you need to learn how to earn your own trust first." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Maggie could almost hear the weight of his regret, but she wasn't in a hurry to fix it for him. This wasn't her responsibility anymore. "I'll prove it to you," Noah said finally, his voice steady but full of a determination Maggie hadn't heard before. "I want to be a better father, a better son. I've seen the strength in you, Mom, the way you've stood tall. I want to learn how to be that strong, too." Maggie didn't respond right away. She had always dreamed of hearing these words, but now that they were spoken, it wasn't the resolution she had expected. She had come to understand that healing couldn't be forced. It had to happen on its own time, in its own way. "Take your time, Noah," she said finally, a quiet assurance in her voice. "I'm not going anywhere, but I need you to know that I won't wait for you to change. I've built a life that I'm proud of, and now I live it for me. And that's what you need to do too." Noah's apology was only part of the story. Maggie had learned that family could be redefined, not just by blood, but by respect, trust, and mutual care. As the days passed, she focused on mending the pieces of her own heart that had been neglected for so long. She didn't need Noah to give her permission to heal. She had already done that herself. And in the midst of her growing empire, Maggie found something else, something she hadn't expected. Tessa, ever the steadying force in her life, came to her with an idea that would deepen their bond even more. "What if we work on something together?" Tessa asked one evening, sitting across from Maggie at their favorite cafe, her eyes glowing with purpose. "Something for military families and women veterans. We can use our influence to create real, lasting change, giving them the resources they need to succeed." Maggie felt a warmth spread through her chest at the idea. Tessa had always been her protector, but now she was her partner in this new chapter. Together, they could make a difference in a way that went beyond their individual successes. They would combine their strength, their platforms, and their passions to support the women who had been overlooked, the ones who had fought for a place in the world but had been denied. "I love that idea," Maggie said, her voice filled with pride. "Let's make it happen." Together, they launched an initiative focused on providing leadership training and career development to military families and veterans, especially women, who had often been sidelined in their fields. It was the perfect way to channel their influence, to create the kind of change that Maggie had always dreamed of. While the initiative flourished, Maggie found herself stepping back from some of her professional duties. For the first time in years, she made time for herself and for Tessa. She wasn't running on empty anymore. She was living the life she had built for herself. Her success wasn't just measured in numbers, but in the impact she made on the people she loved and the world around her. Her relationship with Noah was still fragile, but it was different now. They were rebuilding, but she was no longer waiting for him to save her. She was teaching him, showing him how to build a life he could be proud of, not for her, but for himself. And that was enough. She had realized that family didn't always have to be perfect. It just had to be real. One evening, as Maggie watched Tessa speak passionately about their new initiative at a local veterans event, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had always wanted to make a difference, and now she was doing it. Not for validation, but for the people who needed her voice. The conversation she had with Tessa that night stayed with her long after they had finished speaking. As Tessa spoke about the power of women standing together, Maggie realized something important. Family can be chosen, Maggie said softly, her words drifting into the stillness of the room. Tessa turned to her, her eyes full of understanding. Yes, and we choose each other. Always. Maggie smiled, her heart swelling with pride. Tessa had learned that lesson from her, and now the roles had reversed. Maggie wasn't just teaching her daughter how to navigate the world. She was learning too, learning that the people who truly appreciate you will always stand by your side, no matter what. As they left the event that night, Maggie took a deep breath, the cool night air filling her lungs. Her life had been redefined, not just by her own strength, but by the love and respect she had built with Tessa, and with the family she had chosen. The past had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. What mattered now was the future they would build together. And Maggie knew, with certainty, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The view from Maggie's balcony had never looked so peaceful. The city lights twinkled below, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. It was late, and the world outside seemed to move at a different pace, slower, calmer, as if it too was finally taking a breath. Maggie sat on the edge of her chair, a glass of wine in hand, and allowed herself to simply be. The years of pain, the betrayal, the weight of what she had lost, and ultimately, what she had gained. Everything seemed to come together in this moment of stillness. She had triumphed, in ways that went far beyond financial success. Yes, her empire had flourished. Yes, her name had become synonymous with resilience, strength, and leadership. But more than that, she had found something deeper: peace. Peace that came from understanding that her worth wasn't measured by others' approval, and peace that came from choosing, finally, to live life on her own terms. Tessa joined her on the balcony, the night air cool and refreshing. Maggie looked at her daughter, the woman who had been both her rock and her inspiration. They had come a long way, both individually and together. Tessa had grown into the leader Maggie always knew she would be, and Maggie herself had found her voice in a world that had once tried to silence her. "How's the new project going?" Maggie asked, her voice gentle but filled with pride. Tessa smiled, her eyes alight with excitement. "It's coming together. We've had a great response so far. We're helping these young women transition into civilian careers after their time in service. It's amazing to see them start to believe in their potential." Maggie nodded, feeling a swell of pride. She knew this was just the beginning. The nonprofit they were building together was about far more than just giving back. It was about creating lasting change. Maggie had always known that her success wasn't just for herself. It was for those who hadn't had the same opportunities, for the women who had been overlooked, for the ones who still needed someone to believe in them. "What you're doing is so important, Tess," Maggie said, her voice soft with emotion. "You're changing lives, and I couldn't be prouder of you." Tessa leaned in, resting her head on Maggie's shoulder. "I learned it all from you, Mom." The warmth between them was palpable, like the quiet bond that had always held them together. It was the peace that Maggie had embraced, not just with herself, but with the woman sitting beside her, her daughter, her partner in this journey. Noah had become a presence in their lives once again, but this time it was different. He was no longer consumed by guilt or indecision. Over time, he had distanced himself from Claire, and though the process had been slow, it was clear that he was beginning to see the value of family, the real value, not the control and manipulation he had grown accustomed to. He spent more time with Maggie and Tessa, but the visits weren't filled with the tension that once existed. There were no ultimatums, no need for Maggie to constantly prove herself to him. He was no longer just a son asking for forgiveness. He was a man, trying to understand the woman his mother had become. He was beginning to understand the power of choice and the importance of choosing the right people to be in your life. One afternoon, Noah and Tessa sat down to talk, just the two of them. Maggie watched from the window, a sense of quiet satisfaction filling her heart. She knew this was the first step in him truly rebuilding his life, understanding the strength of the family he had almost lost. Maggie's memoir, Reclaimed. The power of forgiveness and self-belief continued to soar in popularity, its message resonating with women all over the world. It had become more than just a book. It was a movement. Readers sent letters, messages, and emails, sharing their stories of how Maggie's words had changed their lives. Women from all walks of life found hope in her journey, a reflection of their own struggles and triumphs. For Maggie, the letters were a daily reminder that what she had accomplished wasn't just for her, it was for them too. For every woman who had been told she wasn't enough, for every woman who had been silenced, her story was their story. One evening, as Maggie sat in her office reading yet another heartfelt message from a reader, she paused. She could feel the weight of everything she had built, but it wasn't the awards or the recognition that mattered most. It was the lives she had touched, the women who now had the courage to step into their power because she had shown them it was possible. Her travels took her all over the world, speaking at global forums, sharing her message of resilience and leadership. She wasn't just a businesswoman anymore. She was a global advocate for women's rights, helping other women rise into leadership roles. She used her platform to challenge the status quo and break down barriers for those who had been left out of the conversation for far too long. And yet, despite all the accolades, despite the recognition, Maggie had come to understand something crucial. The real work had always been about the people closest to her. The relationships she had worked to heal, the bonds she had strengthened, were the true foundation of her legacy. One evening, as Maggie and Tessa sat together on the balcony once more, the weight of everything they had accomplished settled between them like a comfortable silence. The night stretched out before them, quiet, full of promise. "You did it, Mom," Tessa said softly, her voice filled with awe and affection. Maggie smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "We did it." Tessa nodded, her eyes full of pride. "I think we've both built something real." Maggie took a moment to look at her daughter, at the woman who had become her strength, her ally. This was her legacy, building something that would last, not through wealth or fame, but through the lives they had changed, the women they had empowered. "You've made me proud, Tessa," Maggie said, her voice filled with emotion. "You've given me the greatest gift, showing me what it means to be truly powerful." Tessa smiled, her gaze steady. "You did that, Mom. You showed me how." And in that moment, as the stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, Maggie knew that the road ahead was still full of possibility, full of potential. She had embraced the peace she had always sought, and now she could look forward with clarity, knowing that whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms, because the future, as she had learned, was hers to create, and she had only just begun. Maggie stood at the edge of the stage, her heart pounding in rhythm with the applause that filled the grand hall. The energy of the room was electrifying, but as she looked out over the sea of faces, she realized it wasn't the cheers that mattered. It was the work, the years of dedication, the late nights, the countless sacrifices that had led her here. Her name had become synonymous with success, but the truth of her life's journey was far deeper than the accolades and awards. She had reached the pinnacle, not just in business, but in life. Her empire spanned continents, her nonprofit initiatives were flourishing, and her influence in the world of women's leadership had become undeniable. She was no longer just a figurehead of a company. She was a symbol of what was possible when a woman decided to take control of her life. She had defied every expectation, built from the ground up, and now she was leading a movement. But as the lights dimmed and the applause gradually faded, Maggie couldn't help but think of the quiet moments, the ones that mattered most. The moments spent in stillness, reflecting on everything she had fought for, everything she had gained, and, perhaps most importantly, everything she had given away to those who needed it. Tessa's career, too, was continuing to rise. As a leader in her field, she had become a beacon for other women, both in the military and beyond. Her voice was now one of authority, not just in the Navy but also in the broader conversation about gender equality. The nonprofit they had founded together, focused on supporting military families and women veterans, had gained even more traction, with their combined influence making a lasting impact. "It's incredible, isn't it?" Tessa said one evening as they sat side by side, watching the sunset from Maggie's penthouse. "We've really done it, and I couldn't have asked for a better partner?" Maggie smiled, her heart full. "No, we couldn't have," she agreed, her voice calm but filled with gratitude. Tessa had always been her rock, but now she was her equal. The work they had done together would echo far beyond their lifetimes. Noah had reached out again, as Maggie had expected. He had changed, no longer weighed down by guilt or uncertainty. Over time, he had distanced himself from Claire, had begun to look inward, examining the choices that had led him to the brink of losing his family. One day, Maggie received a message from him, asking for a quiet conversation. When he arrived at her apartment, he was different, more composed, his face etched with both regret and resolution. "I've been thinking a lot, Mom," Noah began, standing in the doorway, his voice calm, as though the weight of their past no longer held him in place. "I've made so many mistakes. I've hurt you. I've been silent for too long, and I can't undo that. But I want you to know that I'm sorry, and I'm committed to being a better father and son." Maggie studied him for a moment, her heart neither hardened nor eager to forgive. Instead, she simply nodded. She wasn't waiting for an apology from him anymore. She had long since come to terms with the fact that she couldn't change the past. What mattered now was the present, and whether or not he could be the man she needed him to be. "I don't need your apology, Noah," she said, her voice steady. "I've already healed. I've rebuilt my life on my own terms. But I'm willing to be here. For you, if you're truly ready to rebuild too. I don't expect perfection. But I expect honesty, and I expect respect. That's all I can offer, and it's all I'll accept." Noah met her gaze, a mix of gratitude and understanding in his eyes. For the first time, he wasn't asking for her to fix him. He was ready to take responsibility for his own journey. Maggie didn't need to hear more. She had already found peace, and that was more than enough. As the months passed, Maggie allowed herself to step back, enjoying the fruits of the life she had worked so hard to build. She traveled more, explored new corners of the world, and relished in moments of solitude that had once seemed so elusive. The frantic pace of her previous years had given way to a calmer rhythm, one where she could reflect on all that she had achieved, without the pressure of constantly proving herself. Her memoir, Reclaimed, The Power of Forgiveness and Self-Belief, continued to inspire millions of women around the globe. Every letter she received, every message from a reader, reminded her that the true measure of her success wasn't in the numbers or the awards, it was in the lives she had touched. One evening, Maggie sat by the fire with a glass of wine, the book open in front of her. The words of women who had shared their stories, their struggles, their victories, filled her heart. She had given them the courage to step forward, and now, they were changing the world in their own ways. Tessa was flourishing too, now a well-known figure in both the military and the global stage of gender equality. As she prepared to release her own book, a guide for women in the military on leadership and resilience, Maggie couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Her daughter had taken the lessons Maggie had taught her and made them her own, paving the way for future generations of women. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Maggie found herself sitting on the balcony once more, looking out at the vast city below. The lights twinkled like stars and the world felt vast and full of possibilities. She thought of her journey, how far she had come from the woman she once was, waiting for someone else to validate her worth, to the woman she had become, strong and empowered, living her truth. They thought they could break me, she whispered to herself, a small, satisfied smile curving her lips. But I built a life that no one can take away, and that's my legacy. And with that, Maggie let the peace of the moment wash over her. The future was hers to shape, and she was more than ready